I'm one of the pastors here. So if you are new, we're in the middle of a series called Surrendered. We're talking about sexuality, relationships, and identity. Now, just to be clear, if you're here, this is your first time here, we don't often talk about this. In fact, in the 4 and nearly 5 years I've been here, this is the only time we've really touched on these things. So here's the question we're asking in this series. As a disciple of Jesus, what does it mean to surrender all of my life, including my sexuality, relationships, and identity, to him? Normally at this point, I'd do a little brief recap of where we've been. I'm just going to say I haven't got time. Last week's talk was like 48 minutes, and I know none of you want that again. So you can go back, wherever you find your podcast, search for Nem Valley Vineyard. You can listen back and find out where we've been. And to say this is some of you are going to be mighty relieved by my next statement. This is the last one in this particular series. Some of you are totally fine. But here's what I would say. I have not covered everything there is to say about any of the things I've talked about. And actually, some of these things are ever changing in culture, and it's a job to keep up with what is happening in culture. But to say you might have questions. My hope in all of this is that it enables us to have conversations, to grow in awareness, to increase our thoughtfulness, to see more discipleship moments in our lives, and a greater sense of consecration amongst all of us. And so here's what I'm going to try and do today, briefly. One, I'm going to talk about identity, particularly as it relates to things like gender. And then I want to finish by just talking about what is it like to have a whole life consecration of ourselves to God. And within that, I'm going to try and answer some of the questions that came through last week. Now, on the screen there's a QR code. If you have questions that come up, just scan them. You can engage with those and ask questions there. I don't know if we'll get time to get to them. I will try. Maybe we'll need to find some other way to do that. I don't know. So, firstly, then, identity, particularly as it relates to gender. So if you've come across the phrase transgenderism, it is currently, the way I say this, and I mean this with gentleness, is it's a force in our culture at the moment. My observation is that it is becoming the point in what gets broadly called the culture wars around sexuality. It's becoming the point at which a whole bunch of people who would have said they would have been, really for the gay rights movement and all that stuff. This is the point at which some people who've supported the movement up to this point are going, I'm not sure about the boundaries that we are crossing. And just to note that there's in our culture, I think there's a big moment of like a pause, of like no, I'm not sure about this one. But because it's so wrapped up in what gets called culture wars, I want to say this. People who wrestle with their gender, with sexuality, are people that Jesus longs to disciple. He loves them. In fact, I would say he took himself to the cross for them as much as he did for us. So we should come to them with compassion, love, and gentleness, and a desire for them to find hope in Jesus. We, as Christians, we need to avoid the outrage of a culture war that we so easily get dragged into. I think Jesus calls us to be peacemakers. But we do have to be aware, within that, what I'm not saying is we need to embrace sin, but what I am saying is maybe we need to embrace the war wounded. Think about Jesus' words. Matthew 5. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Paul encourages the church later on. 2 Corinthians 5, 18 and 19. God reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sin against them. And so as we wrestle with the issues, this is the place I want to jump off of. Where we see big issues in culture, I think Jesus sees people that he longs to reconcile to God. And the ones of us who carry that message, well, that's us, the church. And our desire, above all other desires, should be to see other people reunited with their Creator. And there's challenges in that, because if we want to be reconciled, we have to lay down our rights and our freedoms and place them at Jesus' feet and follow him. And that's difficult. But that's not just difficult for people that experience issues around gender or same-sex attraction. That's difficult for all of us every day. In practice. In theory, we go, that's dead easy. In practice, that is more difficult. And so when I say transgender, what do we mean? And I'm going to lean a lot on somebody called Mark Yarhouse, who is a clinical psychologist who's also a Christian. He's written a really helpful book. He's written a number of helpful books. The one I'm going to reference the most today is called Understanding Gender Dysphoria. And he would talk about gender dysphoria like this. People who experience gender dysphoria, that is when someone's physical sex, male or female, the biological body, and their emotional, psychological experience as a male or a female don't feel like they align. And what happens is there is, in this misalignment, there is then an excruciating distress of living in this tension. And what's most interesting about that, he says, this is all him as a clinical psychologist, is this is identified in children normally between the ages of 2 and 4. And this is what we refer to as gender dysphoria. Now, this doesn't include everything under the umbrella term of transgender. I'm going to unpack that a little bit more. But if people are experiencing a genuine gender dysphoria, they often need psychological intervention and plenty of support. The numbers are really hard to gauge on this because there's doing research on it is quite difficult. But here are the estimates, and these, in that sense, these are the most generous estimates, that this would affect 1 in 10,000 men and 1 in 20,000 women. And what's interesting about gender dysphoria, the numbers again vary. Low estimates would say 75 to 80% of cases will resolve in late adolescence without medical intervention of any kind. And this is like I don't know the correct phrase to use. This is a bona fide psychological issue that isn't fully understood. There's lots of theories about why it happens. But this is different from some of the other things we might talk about when we talk about transgender issues. So you might hear people talk about themselves as genderqueer or agendered or gender fluid. So just to put this out there for some of us would say those that cross-dress for purposes of arousal or entertainment. Some would put them in this category, but actually most wouldn't. But people who might say they're non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid, etc., there's lots of possibilities there. What's happening in our culture is a lot of this is coming from a place of ideology and not a place of psychology. And so I was talking to a young person even this Friday at youth, and their observation was in school that one of their friends one day would come and say, I think my experience of being a human is non-binary. I don't think I fit the category of male and female. And then within months, a whole friendship group had taken on similar things. And then that passed, as if it was like a fad in a cultural moment. Now, that's not for everybody, but we must recognize that there is something happening there as well. That is almost like a fad is the wrong word, but it's the only word that's coming to mind right now. Okay. So hear that as it's meant, not maybe with the word I've used right there. But some of this is more ideological than psychological. And then within that, there are other people who we have to think carefully about. What about those who are born intersex, where there is an ambiguity of gender based on genitals and chromosomal stuff? One of the interesting things came up when I was researching, thinking particularly about people, those who are intersex, who are born neither male nor female, is if you listen to the North American Intersex Society, they would say actually most people who are born intersex will choose to be male or female. Now that's either with intervention from medical professionals, or because actually the trauma of living with being intersex is so difficult. One of the best ways to help cope with that is to essentially choose, I'm going to be male or female. And so there's a kind of a word for us here. People who experience particularly gender dysphoria, but also plenty of other people in this kind of umbrella of transgender. We need to be conscious of there is a higher risk of suicide in this community. And so I think some of our response must be to recognize that Jesus loves these people and he died for them, and for us to cry out in prayer. Now, in the Christian tradition, the body has been vital to our spiritual formation. And as such, as the Bible and the Christian tradition has viewed biological sex and gender largely as one larger whole piece of a person. So Genesis 1:27 says this: "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them." And a couple of weeks ago, as we were trying to unpack how did we get here with the sexual revolution, particularly in some of the later forms of feminism, what we've seen is this idea that your biology, whether you're born male and female, is something to be overcome. Because to be born with a particular biology is in and of itself a form of oppression. And so what we end up with is two different worldviews competing. The sexual revolution's kind of worldview and that of Scripture. And surprise, surprise, like everything else we've talked about, these are competing. And here's something I would say to us. The Christian worldview has a really high view of the body. And often in the way that the sexual revolution outworks itself, it would give us the impression that we have a low view of humans. But actually, we have a high view of humanity as Christians. And here is one of the challenges, I think, underlying the transgender movement is the whole thing is an internal quest to discover who you are. And now, I don't know about you. When I was at school, I had a hard enough time trying to figure out what I wanted to do for a job, let alone what am I, who am I? And my concern for this generation, for future generations, is that we're going to see an increase in mental health crises as kids in primary school are told, well, you need to decide who you are and what you are. But we also have to be careful because the culture wars are involved. We also need to recognize that actually just because somebody is struggling with their own sense of gender does not mean they are in a camp that wants to eradicate gender specifically. Each transgender person, like anybody else, is an individual. And as Christians, we might do well to think about God's design. Because ultimately, my prayer would be somebody who has experienced some form of gender incongruence would ultimately go to find their identity in Christ. And actually, this is the great hope for any human. This is what I would want anybody to find. What is your identity in Christ? Who has God made you? That is a firm foundation to build your identity upon. But when we talk about God's design, something interesting happens in the church, and maybe this comes from previous culture, I don't know, but we reduce talking about God's design into gender roles. Now, gender roles at times can be really helpful, but there is something that's kind of happened in the background we probably just want to have in mind, that pre the Industrial Revolution, some of the way we view gender roles now didn't function the same. So you would find many people would work from their home, and I know this is something that we kind of have again at the moment, but they would live and work, men and women, in the home together. Men would be much more involved in their children's education and upbringing than we would expect them to be now. And women would contribute economically much more to the home than we would, in some circles, expect them to now. But when the Industrial Revolution came about, what happened was men went off to work, by and large, and the women stayed home. And this is almost a facet of culture more than it is God's design. Now, there's lots of things I could talk about with gender roles. We haven't got time. But this also creeps into the church. So if you are a man, I just want to see if you've been to a men's event that sounds a bit like this. Camping, beer, steak, deadlifting. Maybe you've been to a women's event and it sounds a little bit like this. Encouragement, makeup, watercolour. That actually we have all these stereotypes that we wrap into gender in the church that actually I think are sometimes unhelpful. Because actually we impose these stereotypes upon people that actually I think cause them more questions than good. One classic is, girls must like pink, boys must like blue, but I was trained as a graphic designer, so if you ask me what colour goes best, I go, well, what's it going with, what's it doing? At times, hot pink is the greatest colour you could ever use. And that's a silly example, but do you see how these things get wrapped up? So if our design has been reduced to gender roles, I think this sometimes doesn't help people who have this sense of questions about their gender, because they go, well, I'm a boy, but I don't want to deadlift things and eat steak and camp in a field. And actually, we need to think about gender less about roles and more about displaying the glory of God. That if God created us male and female, and he did that intentionally, there is something that reflects his glory and reveals some truth about him when men and women are together and function together. But also that they release and restrain one another. Here's what I mean. If you put 10 men in a room and just let them chat for like an hour, maybe play cards or something, as soon as a woman walks into the room changes. Now, I don't know exactly how this works for women. I know this works exactly for men. But my hunch is when I've walked into a room full of women and everything goes silent, that there's maybe the same that happens the other way. Now, this is a silly anecdote. I appreciate that. But actually what happens is this. In a room full of men and there's all this banter and there's all this stuff and a woman walks in, well, actually, what happens is the worst parts of the male gender get restrained by the presence of a woman being there. And actually some of the best parts of the male gender get released by a woman being there. All this to say that there's something about men and women living, working, being together that actually is part of God's intention in his design. Deuteronomy 22:5 says this: a woman must not wear men's clothing, nor a man wear women's clothing, for the Lord your God detests anyone who does this. Now, this is part of the Old Testament law, but here is what I would say with absolute clarity is there is clearly something the Lord wants to do here about distinguishing the two genders. Ed Shaw, who's written a great book I'm going to recommend at the end, he says this: gender is not a social construct. And this is the argument of the sexual revolution, that gender is just another social construct. He says this: gender is not a social construct, it is a divine one. And so as we talk about all this, some of us are in the back of our minds, we're thinking, well, but what about people who are intersex? Where do they fit in this? And we would love a nice, tidy answer, and I don't think Jesus gives us one. But here's what Jesus does do. If you ever listen to Jesus, he's great at holding things in tension. In Matthew 19, Jesus says that God's intent was to create people as male and female. He quotes that Genesis 1:27. But he also then, a few verses later, goes on to acknowledge is there are people who are born eunuchs. Now, we don't know exactly what he's referring to with this phrase. But here is my hunch. Some of what they see and witness, the same as we do, is people who are born neither male nor female. Now, one of the sadnesses for some people who are intersex is that also means they can't reproduce. They can't have children. And this phrase Jesus uses is not going to be exclusively intersex people. But what Jesus does is he acknowledges that God has created an intended order, but actually in the brokenness of creation, that there are all sorts of exceptions. There are all sorts of people who do not fit the categories we would like if we could put them in nice, tidy boxes. But listen to what Isaiah says. Isaiah 56:4-5. For this is what the Lord says: to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose what pleases me and hold fast to my covenant, to them I will give within my temple and its walls a memorial and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that will endure forever. What a promise that is. In a sense, to those who just don't fit the category of male and female. Now, eunuch is a complicated one in history. Different cultures viewed them differently. But most cultures would say, well, they're not male nor female, they're something else. But within God's kingdom, if they will follow him and obey him and love him, he will give them a place of great honor. Now, equally, you could read this if you wanted to as permission, around gender fluidity and all that stuff. But I don't think that's actually what's going on here, because actually it requires us to do what pleases the Lord. One question that comes up around transgender issues is, what do we do with pronouns? So some of you you'll have encountered this maybe. That somebody would say, well, I don't feel male nor female, and so you don't call me she or her or he and him. The most common one is they, them. There's other ones as well. Here's what I will do. For two reasons I will do this. One, because they, them breaks my use of language, and I'm not clever enough to get it right. But two, here's what I will do. I will just generally use their names like a normal person. Do you know what I mean? But that sounds... There is my own perspective on this. We just don't need to be unkind, because these are people who are wrestling. Now, what do we do if our children, and this was one of the questions that came up last week, what do we do if our children talk about feeling as if they might be transgender or if they come out as gay? And here is my advice to you, to respond slowly first, with patience, to respond with love and kindness. And partly because, particularly in developmental years, we recognize that there's so much in what they're saying that could change all by itself. But here is my advice. What would I do if this was me? What I would do is take even more seriously the need to go through the scriptures with my kids. And not just to go, here's what God says about this issue and that issue. What I would probably do is go, right, let's open the Gospel of Mark and let's just start reading. And let God reveal himself to them in the scriptures and take that more seriously. Then I would probably just take seriously the need as a parent to pray for my kids and pray that they would find wholeness and flourishing in Jesus, and they would discover themselves as his child and not reduce themselves down to their sexuality or a gender or anything like that. But primarily they would go and find themselves as a child of God. And then I would do everything in my power to make Jesus real to them. And actually what that requires is for us to live as if Jesus is real. And some of the difficulty here, what would we do if we discovered our kids were looking at porn or developed some sort of addiction, reading tarot cards, name the list of all the things kids could do wrong. We wouldn't just kick them out for these things. But we would try and help, and we would try and guide them to Jesus. Now, that's just my 2 pennies worth. Okay. What should we say to someone who is transgender, either in a workplace or you're out and about or a friend? And here's what I would say, particularly if they are an unbeliever. The message of the gospel, actually, in an odd way, isn't to be gender binary. The message is, have you heard of the person of Jesus? John Tyson words it like this: I'm not preaching morality, I'm preaching resurrection life. And my prayer is that as a church, we'd be willing to welcome people who are in all sorts of categories we don't really have good categories, or in some cases tolerances for. And actually, as they come, that they would discover Jesus and be transformed by his love. And I remember talking to a pastor who was about to retire. And some of these, as you think through some of these issues as they arise, are going to get increasingly complicated. And I haven't got time to unpack them, but come and ask me if you've got questions. And we want to be people who rely upon the Spirit to know what to do. Who stick to the Scriptures, cling to them as best we can, and follow the Spirit's leading. But what do we do? What about believers who find themselves having issues around gender? This just become more of a discipleship issue. Now, I suppose my conversation would be what do the Scriptures and what did Jesus say about who you are in Him? What does it mean to be a child of God? To be co-heirs with Christ? To recognize that in the Scriptures, God makes us male and female. And I would want to wrestle with that with them, walk with them, pray a lot. Do some of the work around, there's a clash of kingdoms here, what's happening underneath. And ultimately then the thing that, and this is true for all of us, this would be true of almost any pastoral issue I would face, would be to explore the idea that when we say we follow Jesus, then we follow Jesus and do what he says at great personal cost at times. And that's not just an issue for people who have issues around gender and sexuality, that's every single one of us at different points in our lives. Further reading on this, I would recommend Understanding Gender Dysphoria by Mark Yarhouse. Another one I'd recommend is Embodied by Preston Sprinkle. So I shared his book last week called A People to Be Loved, which is basically goes, what do the Scriptures say about this? So Embodied is his attempt to do that for all the issues around transgenderism. It's called Embodied. And just see where he, well, I won't spoil the ending, but he would largely agree with the things that are written here. That's helpful. But I do want to switch gears quickly. One of the issues that stood out from the questions last week in particular was the idea that as we explored same-sex attraction, the idea that we might expect somebody to commit themselves to a life of singleness and celibacy was a real difficult one for some people in the room. And so I want to try and paint a bit of a vision of the single life and celibacy, because actually, if celibacy is just not having sex, that's never going to work for anybody. Celibacy is much more than that. And I want to start by saying this. If you are single in our church, however you've come to be single, whether that's by choice, by calling, or just because life has been unkind to you, we are so very glad you are here. And actually that needs saying sometimes, because just for some of the rest of us who are married, church inadvertently becomes the married club by accident. We don't mean to, but that's where we end up. And my other invitation to you is I would love you to help us shape the future of our church community. To make it more embracing and welcoming for those who aren't married. Because I recognize there is a bias towards those who are married. And actually, there shouldn't be. Jesus and Paul both say, if you can be single, that's the one. Okay, do that. I would love our church to be known for how well single people are drawn into the life of our church. I don't just mean welcomed, I mean drawn into the life of our family. That they end up involved, they're not discounted from leadership because they're single or anything like that. And not to do away with married couples, you'll be pleased to know, some of you, but to kind of redraw the balance and ask some questions about the way we do things. To reimagine the shared life together. To imagine a rich tapestry of people from all cultures and backgrounds, ages, married status, dating status, all the rest of it. Imagine a life full of shared meals, shared holidays, big parties, nights playing Monopoly, people's kids calling each other, referring to the adults as auntie and uncle. There's just a whole life to be involved in. That go on mission trips together, that have adventures, that will just get in the car and drive to the beach one day because it sounds like fun, because sometimes we're allowed to just have fun as Christians. Now, here's what I would say, though. I don't really have any answers more than thoughts. And as somebody who is married, I'm not the one to help come up with the ideas. But my job as the pastor is to sit down, listen, and try and champion some of those ideas. To give an example for those of us who are married and you're currently like, well, I think we're pretty good at including people who are single. Take, for example, if you are married, that you get lots of celebrations every year. So you get a birthday, which nobody forgets because you live in a house of people, and if they forget, they get in trouble. You get wedding anniversaries every year. Particularly some of you men probably need reminding that those might be coming soon. But if you've got kids, you also then get Mother's Day or Father's Day. And these roll around every single year. But for those who are single, actually, this can be a really isolating thing because people forget your birthday. And big things happen in life that nobody bothers to celebrate, that if you were married, you might celebrate. Moving home, getting a job promotion, retiring. Those things would get celebrated in a marriage naturally. But these things happen and no one celebrates. No one turns up to say congratulations. There's no flowers. There's no card given. If you're married, you get cared for when you're sick, hopefully. If you fell into depression, your loved one would rally around you. They might tell other people, could you come and see so-and-so because they're feeling really low. One of the common things that came up because I've just been exploring how do we better orient the church for people who are single. One of the things that came up over and over again was how isolating sickness is. Because you're just on your own. No one is checking in on you. No one's bringing you chicken soup. No one's bringing you groceries. No one's checking if you've got paracetamol or whatever you need. No one's doing those things. And look, I say all of this because if we want to take seriously the idea that we want to, there's some people we'd love you to consecrate yourself to Christ and to do that through celibacy, then we as the church may have to do a better job in some areas of life to embrace that properly. I think my hunch is if it's some of the pain, because actually the call to celibacy is hard. In a minute, I'm going to give some of us who are married an out by saying marriage is hard too. But actually, those who are called to celibacy, that's a hard call. But I think it might be eased by a genuine community that isn't so focused on eros love. We talked about these different Greek loves. Here's what I mean by that. Not that we're all mentally, obsessed with sex, but actually we inadvertently have built a culture around romance, around married couples. But instead we focus on agape love, this self-giving love that gives to others. Or the other kind of love that's mentioned in the Bible that's had no mention at all, so here we go. Phileo love, which is kind of a brotherly, sisterly love. If you've ever, the place, Philadelphia, the city in America, it's the city of brotherly love. It's that phileo word. And I wonder actually if as a community we would get better at agape and phileo love, not just that kind of building our stuff around romance, whether that would help ease some of our brothers and sisters' anxiety, pain, loneliness. Celibacy goes beyond just being single. The first week we did talk about the sexual revolution's lens is that human flourishing is found in sexual fulfillment. But actually a Christian narrative would say, no, we disagree with that. Human flourishing is found in finding yourself in God's love. And for those who feel called to celibacy, there's some wonderful promises. I referenced this last week, but I'll do it again because I think it went over some people's heads. In Revelation 14, there is a lot happening because it's Revelation. I'll let you go and read it in context. But here's what it says. A crowd of people turn up. And it says this: these are those who did not defile themselves with women. They remained virgins. They followed the Lamb wherever he goes. They were purchased from among mankind and offered as first fruits to God and the Lamb. There's something here about those who have committed to celibacy. but they are offered as the first fruits from among all of mankind. The celibate life is a journey into Christ that is in one sense, a great privilege for those who can bear it. You know, I briefly talked about this last week, and this doesn't take away the pain of it that comes with it as well. But in singleness, there are opportunities to serve God and say yes to him in ways that are just made more complicated by marriage and having kids and stuff like that. There's opportunities to delve into the depths of prayer, into scriptures, into God's presence that actually, can I be honest, are totally robbed by 4-year-olds. Equally, marriage isn't the ideal way to live in that sense. It's not the thing we should aim for if it's not for us. When you get married, you make a covenant with God, but with the other person, that you are going to stay with them until death separates you. That's the vow we all make. But here is the truth about marriage for some people, that actually they get married hoping it will fulfill all of their needs, but they discover that marriage does not fulfill all of their needs, like they thought, or in some cases in the church, like they were promised. One pastor I was listening to observed this. He said actually that over the years, he was, worked in a city, so actually it was a place where there was more single people, because it's a big city, than we probably find ourselves here in Raunds. Okay? And his observation was this: loneliness was more common in marriage than it was in singleness. And here's what his suspicion was. The exclusive nature of marriage, a committal to one another, can lead people to feeling lonely. The problem being, nobody bothers to look for the lonely people in marriage because they're in a marriage. They shouldn't be lonely. And so, actually, people in marriages can end up more lonely because nobody is looking for them there. Now, we all have a part to play in being a community in which both celibacy, singleness, and marriage thrives. And that's my great longing. Whoever we are, as we come before God, that we find a place of thriving in him, but in community as well. Now, some recommended readings on this. One is a book called Notes on Love by Lauren Windle. So she's somebody who is single, Christian, been a Christian for 10 years, all sorts of amazing story around finding sobriety. But it's just basically written a book of, like, if you are in church and you're married, this book might be worth a read. And I read it. It was challenging, slightly upsetting at times, probably in a good way, but worth a read. It says some things that you're not sure should be written down, but if you can cope with that, then okay. And then the other one is this, The Plausibility Problem, by somebody called Ed Shaw. Ed is a pastor in Bristol who is same-sex attracted and celibate. And so he's written this book. He said the problem about celibacy is we all believe it's a totally implausible idea. And so he's written this. And this, again, is a challenge to us as the church, because he recognizes that if we're just calling people to just not have sex forever and leave them to it, that's a cruel thing in some ways. And so, if I could just summarize everything I've tried to say the last little while, recognizing that there is more conversations to be had, more things to be prayed through, worked through, more pastoral issues for us to work through together, it would be this, that each one of us, every single one of us, when it comes to our sexuality, relationships, identity, but actually our whole selves, are called to a few things. One is consecration to God. That actually, as we consecrate ourselves, as we set ourselves apart to God for his glory, there will be things he asks of us that are difficult, but it is a place that we can flourish. That's true whether we are married, single, experiencing same-sex attraction, we have struggles with gender, that we all have to face the challenge to daily consecrate ourselves to him. But as we consecrate ourselves to him, then actually our hope is that we experience transformation. Jesus is in the business of transformation. whatever our challenges around sexuality or gender or our marriages or singleness or really anything, he is in the business of redeeming. And so as we consecrate ourselves to him, as we are transformed by Jesus, we draw ourselves to him, then we find liberation there too. And here's what I mean. Sometimes I think we hear the word liberation and we think, oh, everything is just wonderful all the time. We can frolic around the fields like children. That's not really what I mean. But when Jesus says in John 10:10, I've come that they may have life and have it to the full, that becomes a reality for us, that we find liberation in him. Now, there is plenty of conversations that I think we have to carry on over the coming weeks, months, years. And to say, I tried to lay this heavy on the first week, that I, others, the leadership team, Ash, we are here for difficult pastoral conversations. And you're not going to be met with anger, but with compassion and a listening ear. And what you share with us will remain confidential unless it's a safeguarding issue or puts other people at risk. So should we stand and pray? I made it to 40 minutes, guys. I think that's enough.